In this video, you're going to learn how to use event acknowledgements. They are a fantastic feature inside of Socket.io. In order to illustrate exactly what they are and why you'd ever want to use them, we're going to quickly run through the slides for the chat app. These are the two events that we actually have in our application. If you remember, the first one is the new message event. It gets emitted by the server and it gets listened to by the client. It sends across the from, text, and created app properties, all of which are required to render the message to the screen. Now, the event that we're going to be updating is the create message event. This one gets emitted by the client and listened to by the server. Once again, we are sending some data across from and text. Now, the problem with our create message event is that the data flows in one direction. The data comes from a form inside of the browser. It then gets sent over to the server, and the server is kind of stuck. Sure, the data might be valid. The from and text fields might be correctly set up. In that case, we can emit a new message event, rendering it to every browser who's connected to the server. But if the server receives invalid data, it has no way to let the client know that something went wrong. What we need is a way to acknowledge we got a request and have the option to send some data back. In this case, we're going to add an acknowledgement for create message. If the client emits a valid request with valid from and text properties, we're going to acknowledge it, sending back no error message. If the data sent from client to server is invalid, we're going to acknowledge it, sending back the errors, so the client knows exactly what it needs to do to send a valid request. Now, the result is going to look a little bit like this, and the data flow from server to client is going to be done via a callback. Your acknowledgement could be anything you like. In our case, it could be, was the message data valid? If you're creating an email application, you might only send the acknowledgement back to the client when the email was successfully sent. You don't need to send data, which is what we're going to do when valid data is sent across the pipeline. We're simply going to say, hey, we got that message, everything's good to go, and the client can respond to that. Now that we've gone through this, let's go ahead and implement it into our application. Setting up acknowledgements really isn't that bad if you already have a listener in place. All you have to do is make a quick change to the listener and a quick change to the emitter, and everything will work as expected. Now, in this case, the listener happens to be on the server and the emitter is going to be on the client, but acknowledgements also work in the other direction. I can emit an event from the server and I can acknowledge it from the client. In order to set this up, we are going to emit a create message event over inside of index.js using socket.emit. And we're going to pass in the same arguments we would otherwise. The first one is the event name, create message, and we're going to pass in some valid data, an object with those two properties. We can set from equal to something like Frank, and we can set a text property equal to something like hi. Now with this in place, we have a standard event emitter and a standard event listener. I can go ahead and start up the app using NodeMon, and we can make sure everything's working as expected. NodeMon server, server.js. Once the server is up, we can visit it in the browser. I'm going to open up the developer tools as well. Then we're going to go to localhost 3000. And you can see over inside of the terminal, we have create message showing up, and we also have new message showing up here. We have the new message for our little welcome to the chat app greeting, and we have the new message from Frank, which we emitted. Now, the goal here is to send an acknowledgement from the server back to the client that we got the data. In order to get this done, we have to make a change to both the listener and the emitter. If you only make a change to one, it is not going to work as expected. We're going to start with the event emitter. We want a way to run some code when the acknowledgement has been sent from the server back to the client. In order to get that done, we're going to add a third argument, which is going to be a callback function. This function is going to fire when the acknowledgement arrives at the client, and we can do anything we like. For now, we'll just print using console.log. Got it. Now, this is all we need to do, bare bones style, to add an acknowledgement to the client. On the server, it's also pretty simple. We're going to add a second argument to our callback argument list. The first one is still going to be the data that was emitted. The second one, though, is going to be a function that we're going to refer to as callback. And we can call it anywhere down below to acknowledge that we got the request. When we call this function, like we're going to call it right here, it is in turn going to send an event back to the front end, and it is going to call the function as we have it here. This means that if I save both files, we can play around with acknowledgements over in the browser. I'm going to refresh the app. And what do we get? We get Got it. That means our data successfully went to the server. We can prove that by seeing the console log statement here. The server acknowledged it got the data by calling callback, and right here, got it, prints. Now, acknowledgements are pretty useful, but they're even more useful when you send data back. If the data for the message is invalid, for example, we're probably going to want to send some errors back, something we will be doing a little later. For now, though, we can play around with an acknowledgement by sending anything we want back. We send data back by providing one argument to callback. If you want to add multiple things, simply specify an object, adding as many properties as you like. In our case, though, we can send as the only argument to callback a string. I'm going to set my string to "this is from the server." This string is going to be passed into the callback, and it's going to end up inside of our callback right here, which means I can create a variable for that value. We can call it data or anything else you like, and we can print it to the screen or do something with it. For now, we're just going to print it to the screen. If I save index.js, we can test that everything is working as expected. I'm going to go ahead and give the app a refresh, and what do we see? We see got it, meaning we got the acknowledgement, and we see the data that was sent from the server to the client. Acknowledgements play an important role in real-time applications. Let's go back to that email app example for a second. Imagine I type in some values like a to value and a text value when I send the email. I want to get an acknowledgement back that either A, the email sent successfully, or B, the email did not send successfully, in which case I want to know why. Maybe it was a form error where I can show some error messages to the user, or maybe the server was down for maintenance or something like that. Either way, acknowledgements allow the request listener to send something back to the request emitter. Now that we know how to use acknowledgements, we're going to integrate them into our application. That is coming up in the next video as we add an actual form field to our index.html file where users can submit new messages and view them. It's all coming up next. Stay tuned. I will see you then.